Shall we get going? Let's get going. And more people can filter in. And those of you filtering in, please feel free to sit near the front. So I'm Rebecca MacKinnon. I won't explain myself. Sitting here with me, going from this end to the other end, we have Dowdy Wary from Ushahidi. We have Mohamed ElGohary from Global Voices. Ivan, our illustrious leader, and
not my leader.
The supreme leader of Global Voices. We have Niels Hanover from Article 19 and Ellery Biddle of Global Voices Advocacy. And I'm going to place some blame squarely on Ivan because I often blame him for things, which is that this panel was Ivan's idea. But it was one that we all sort of agreed to, is that because this panel is about funding, right? And it's about the fact that the people who work in activism, people who work in citizen media, people who work in the digital rights space, we need to get funded ultimately in order to grow our projects. That somebody needs to be paid. You need to pay for server space, even if your software is open source. You need to have an infrastructure to do things. You can't run an organization on thin air and do everything for free. So the question is, how does funding affect what you do? And we've had conversations at Global Voices from the very beginning of our existence about what kind of funding we would take, what kind of funding we would not take, and how different choices about funding would affect the organization, and how those choices affect the organization at different stages of the organization's development. So you might make certain choices at the beginning of your organization's launch and then change your mind over time as the organization grows, and how you deal with these conversations, how you deal with your stakeholders about how your funding is handled is also very key, and so on. So what we want to do is, rather than have presentations or speeches, to really have a conversation. And so we're going to just hear a number of different perspectives on funding from the panelists, and I'm encouraging them to interrupt one another and ask each other questions. But I'm also encouraging all of you, because one of the other reasons we wanted to have this panel is that a lot of conversations about funding, most of them don't happen in public. They happen amongst people who get funding and people who give funding, but the people who are employed by the organizations that get the funding, or the people who consume the products or benefit from the products of the organization that get funding, are completely unaware of these conversations. So we wanted to bring this out in the open. So there's a whole lot of jargon in the kind of donor grantee kind of world. And so if there's anything that anybody says here that makes no sense to you, or that you think you need clarification about, or that you think needs to be challenged immediately without waiting to kind of get to the discussion time, I hope you'll kind of wave at us, jump up and down, and ask for clarification or explanation or so on. So with that, and all of you who've come in since we started, please come to the front. Please don't sit in the back unless your intention is not actually to listen to what we're saying and do your email. But fortunately, there's no internet here, so that's probably not what you're doing. So you might as well come to the front and have a conversation and participate. Okay, so we're going to start out with Niels. And, there's something of a game to getting grants, deciding how you're going to get grants. If you're sort of explaining to someone who comes to your organization fairly new to this whole kind of field, as it were, how do you explain the way in which you think about funding, how it affects your work, and why it matters and why it's important for people to understand?
Okay, let me ask
let me start with a question. Who of you has ever received funding? Who of you wants to receive funding? Let me start.
Oh yeah. I forgot.
Let me start with a confession. I am Niels, and I'm a funding addict. And as to all addictions, there are good things, because else you would not be addicted to it, and there are bad things. So the first time when I wanted to get funding was to get a project done. I had a dream, I had an idea, I had something that I really wanted to do, but to do that, I needed money to buy equipment, to buy plane tickets, to buy some computers. But while developing that plan, I spent the first 6 months fundraising. So for these first 6 months, I was spending more time on actually getting the money than doing the work that I actually wanted to do. And I think this became a bit of a threat through my career, that I've spent a pretty big proportion of my time getting funding. And when you have funding, and you think, I landed that grant, whew, now it really starts. Yeah, then only it really starts. The reporting. And the project management. And the financial reporting. And getting the indicators in place. And having an M&E plan. And then you think, oh, I'm finally done. No, then there's final reporting. And then there's more fundraising. So, I want to say one thing. That getting funding is not an easy thing, and that's it. And there's also a lot of politics attached to it. But let me give you some tips, because I've been in this game now a bit, so I can give you some good advice. Never, 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 never write a whole project proposal without having talked to the donor. If they don't know you, and you don't know them, you don't know exactly what they want. And there is a secret. Even donors are people. So you can talk to them and ask them what are they interested in. Because you'll need to convince them. And it's easier if you know what they want to say what you want. And then you can see if it matches. And that match is crucial. Because donors have a strategy. They want to do something. And you should also have a strategy. Because if you do not have a strategy, you are part of someone else's strategy. And then you end up doing things that you don't want to do at all. So it's all about navigating that space, about having time to do what you do, what you need for that, and what you need to do to get that.
That's great. That's a great introduction, and I bet you people are going to have a lot of questions for you later. I'm actually, Ellery, I said I was going to go to you, but I'm actually going to go to Dowdy next, because I think building on what you just said is kind of the issue of different kinds of funding. And, you know, you can get into various gradations, but the three big different types of funding are, of course, foundation funding. So, you know, Soros, MacArthur, Ford, Hivos, and so on. Although Hivos is a hybrid, so we'll talk about that later. And then there's government funding. So various governments want to fund advocacy organizations, media organizations, et cetera, so development organizations, and so on. And they all have agendas, just as the foundation funders do. And then there's, of course, corporate funding. And those are kind of the three basic types of funding, but there are combinations of it. You want to say something before we go to Dowdy?
Yeah, there's also actually building a constituency and working on the basis of crowds or memberships, which is a very important way, but also has its own dependencies.
That's right. So either crowdsourcing or member funding, so funding from your constituency as well. So donations of some kind or another. And Dowdy, you've worked with different kinds of funders in different contexts. And what are your thoughts about the decisions you have to go through about what types of funding and how they affect you differently?
Thanks. I think I can best speak from our experience at Ushahidi. So good afternoon, people. My name is Daudi Were. I'm Director of Projects at Ushahidi, which is a global technology company that builds data tools, founded and headquartered in Nairobi. Our platforms have been used in 157 countries over 50,000 times and been translated into 45 different languages. So that's the elevator pitch that I have to share. But for the context of this conversation, I think how Ushahidi started is the important story. We started in the middle of the post-election violence in Kenya, and when we noticed our country burning, between the time of Ushahidi and the first prototype being rolled out, it took us 6 days. So we didn't have time to wait for funding. We didn't have time to sit around and do a lot of proposals or project groups. There was a crisis that needed a solution in our country, and we built something for it, and we were able to do it in under a week. So that taught us a couple of things. It taught us, A, that you don't always need to have a lot of time, and B, you don't need to wait for the money before you can move. And from that experience, I think it emboldened the Ushahidi founders to be a bit pragmatic and a bit strategic in how and when to accept funding. So for the first 5-6 years of Ushahidi, we had a policy that we would not accept government funding, we would not accept money from any government in the world, because a lot of it to do with the reporting. We hate writing long reports, and a lot of that money comes with long reports, but also because we felt that it may compromise our neutrality. And this came to serve us very well around the time of the Arab Spring, when many of the governments that were toppled during that period had actually offered money to Ushahidi, so not the traditional funders that you think about. But here's the flip, here's the switch. Right now I work as the Director of Innovation of Making All Voices Count, one of the sponsors of this fantastic summit. And Making All Voices Count is a donor-funded project. We're actually fund managers. We have $55 million to give out in 4 years in 8 African and 12 Asian countries. So we've gone from being this organization that would not accept any government funding to an organization that's actually a fund manager and giving out government funding as part of a consortium with HIVOS and the International Development Institute. So what's the key lesson here? I think, as Neil said, it's all about your agenda, about your strategy. If you don't have a strategy, if you don't have an agenda, you're going to spend all your time fulfilling someone else's agenda. At Ushahidi, after 5 years, after 6 years of being able to do things without government funding, of being able to choose who we take money from, I think one of the biggest successes, one of the biggest benefits we have is the ability to say no. If someone comes and throws money at us, we can say, for our context, what we're trying to do, no. It may even be the same funder that we've used before in a different context. For example, after two or 3 years after Ushahidi started, and we got the idea of forming the iHub, which is really Africa's first technology hub, and the iHub started, and it was a very successful venture. And then the World Bank came and said, hey, we love what you've done with the iHub. Why don't we give you money to replicate this across 30 African countries? But we said no, because what made the iHub successful was that it was organic. It grew out of the Kenyan tech system, and there was no way you could do what we did in Kenya and go and impose it in other countries and expect it to work. It would not work. So at that point, we said no for funding from the World Bank. However, a couple of years later, when we were doing a service delivery project around the Chinese transport system in Beijing, and the World Bank offered to fund it, we said yes, because in that context, they had the local linkages that we had, it made sense. So again, it's all about your strategy, your agenda, and that should drive who you accept funding from.
That's a really good case of exactly sort of how you think about these things. I now want to move over to Ellery, who came to the Global Voices community covering Cuba. And of course, it's quite dangerous for activists in Cuba to receive funding from the United States or the West. So there's this whole issue of risk. There's also the issue that Cuba, of course, is a very politicized issue, and there's a lot of money in the United States that has very large political regime change agendas attached, and then is kind of being funneled into Cuba surreptitiously, and then there are, you know, lots of issues, of course, with the risks to people who are receiving this. And so I'm interested in your perspective on, you know, if you're in a country with a repressive regime and you've got all kinds of political agendas coming from funders that want to work with local groups. You've got groups that need funds to do what they want to do. This is a pretty complicated picture, isn't it?
What are you supposed to do? Yeah, I mean, I think actually, Dowdy, you described iHub as being organic, and that is something that is very hard. When I think about the Cuban context, there are so many entities and groups that have existed for a really long time, for decades, that are, it's a system that, where the kind of experience that Niels talks about of like, oh, I've got this project, I'm gonna build it, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna get the money, I'm gonna do it, it's hard to imagine that kind of mentality there, because it is a almost highly structured ecosystem of groups and organizations that do democracy promoting work and do human rights work, and some of them pursue and accept money from United States government subcontractors, because the US government actually cannot legally give grants directly to Cubans under actually the laws of either country, but they can subcontract it out. So there's a whole set of entities and groups that do take that money, and then there's a set that do not. It has been really interesting to watch how this has affected people who are blogging there, and this is how I came into to spending a lot of time there, and I was sort of studying bloggers and trying to understand how blogging communities formed in Cuba in a place where there's very little internet access and extremely tight control over traditional media. And what has happened is really interesting. From 2006 to 2008-9, there was this, there were a number of people who started blogging on platforms like Blogger and WordPress, and were saying really interesting things, and were, it was a different kind of discourse certainly than what you found in media supported by the state, but also a very different discourse from the sort of old guard human rights organizations there that take US money. But as some of those bloggers became a little bit more politically risk-taking and started to sort of push boundaries a bit more, they started to experience problems, like you lose your job. And when you lose your job, you need money. So you end up in a situation where you know that you could go over to this kind of other part of the civil society sector and make that decision to take this money, and your ability to be employed will be severely reduced. You'll probably lose certain social connections, friendships, people won't, it affects trust quite a lot in communities. And I think it's been really, it's been upsetting to watch this happen to people who weren't quite aware that it was happening. Like, oh, well, I got this grant for this thing and I'm not really sure where the money came from. And then, then you find out. And it also has, even people who do not accept that kind of money, if they associate, then they kind of end up with the mercenary brand. And it's been the last couple of years watching the blogging community go from something that really was organic and diverse and rowdy and really interesting to one where there are a whole lot of people who sort of sound the same, and they're very much in this category of, they're happily working with State Department subcontractors, and that's their choice. But I think I'm not sure how to think about their legitimacy and the legitimacy of the things that they say. Most of the time I think, well, everybody has a right to make money, right? But how has your discourse changed? How has your narrative changed? That's something that I think a lot of us who've been watching this over time really struggle with.
Yeah, and it's even more complicated because, of course, Cuba is not the only country that either bans NGOs from taking overseas money or overseas government's money, and sometimes even overseas foundation money. But when you've got a situation where the NGO sector can't raise money locally, then what else can you do? If you're going to have an NGO sector, what other source is there? Which brings me to Gohary from Egypt, who's going to, you've been watching how in Egypt NGOs have been coming under arrest, have been coming under attack for taking foreign money, and not just government, not just foreign government money, but just foundation money and so on. And how is that affecting people?
After a few years of leniency of Mubarak's era, Mubarak got to start a crackdown on NGOs because basically NGOs cannot raise money, local money, because of the control of military over the business and consequently not being able to fund NGOs. So NGOs, they raise money from international entities, being the Western countries or Western or international NGOs. So after 1984, Mubarak started this crackdown, like storming NGOs and confiscating everything they find and harassing and jailing activists and anyone who try to get international funding under the claims that they are spies, they are following Western propaganda and actually inciting violence against them from neighboring people, like some kind of campaigning to assassinate them, figuratively. But the real problem happened after 2011, when relations between Egypt and the USA became more hostile between the SCAF, or the Supreme Council of Armed Forces in Egypt, and the United States government, that even resulted in jailing several US nationals and Egyptian nationals for receiving funding from US government, and began changing the laws to make the government legally able to detain and stop any NGO by executive order without the need of any legal orders of sorts. So the government currently can close any NGO within a time interval of 45 days without giving any reason and without any resort to legal procedures. So currently, it's theoretically impossible to do any NGO work, whether it is for human rights or whether it is for development. Any NGO is currently liable legally for jail to terms like 25 years, and if you are working in the government, you're even liable to death penalty in some cases. So, the issue also is that international pressure is practically with no it's non-existent, or it doesn't really matter for the Egyptian government to have international pressure. They can do whatever they want, even with like military aid. The military aid is actually now not a weakness for the Egyptian regime, it's a weakness for the United States, because the United States military contractors need the money to operate, to send the military aid to the Egyptian government. So like, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah, it's really tough when there's just, how do you survive when there's no domestic source of funds, and you're arrested from taking funds from anywhere else, and yeah, there's just too many countries like that. And so, which brings me to Ivan, last but not least. I mean, all of this picture that's been painted by the panel kind of helps to show the context that Global Voices is operating in, and other organizations you've worked for in the past as well. But particularly in Global Voices, we're always thinking about, how does the funding we take affect our community? And sometimes it's, they're kind of difficult kind of debates that we have internally, and we're always revisiting those debates. But what do you think are some of the key kind of principles to navigate these really dangerous waters? And before you answer, I just want to tell one other anecdote, because in the panel here, we've talked a lot about government funding. We've talked about kind of foundation funding a bit. One thing we haven't talked about is corporate funding, and of course, I'm currently working on a project that's trying to hold companies accountable to some human rights standards. And this anecdote is relevant because we have debates about corporate funding within our community too. I'm currently running my project out of the think tank where I happened to be at the time, but I continue to, I was actually, when I started the project, I was thinking about maybe taking it to an NGO that works on digital rights rather than in a policy think tank where it happens to be housed at the moment, and looking for an organization that had kind of a digital rights mission. And there were a couple organizations I talked to who said, this is a really great idea, it's a really great project. We take too much corporate funding to work with you directly on this. We can't. We have to stay, we'll support it and so on, we'll report on it, but you can't be housed in our organization. We cannot own your project. And so that just kind of goes to show, one hears sometimes about some NGOs that get a lot of corporate funding seem to focus a lot more on kind of government issues than company issues. And you can say, oh, maybe that's just a coincidence because governments are worse than companies. Or maybe it's not a coincidence, I don't know. Anyway, so with that kind of context, how do we navigate all this?
Well, it's not a coincidence, of course. So let's just... So for Global Voices, and more broadly for activists that are working without a substantial institutional base of support, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that even if you don't take money from those sectors, they will have an influence in your work. And if governmental donors or other donors enter the same space as you. And that happens potentially because the work you have done as an individual is actually quite successful. And we see this in all sorts of activism spaces, and you'll find that there is an attempt on the part of, and I think this is especially true for governmental donors who seek to use development as a language for geopolitical ends. And in many governments, both in Europe and in the United States and Northern America, development aid is increasingly part of foreign affairs and is instrumentalized in that sense. And so, as a simple example, media development work is very often couched in the language of strategic communications, or under the rubric of strategic communications, or lately countering violent extremism. So if you want to receive money from a governmental entity that is doing development work in the media, they're framing the giving of their funds under a larger umbrella of countering violent extremism, and which means that they're seeking to instrumentalize what you do for some other end. And you have to be very careful when you enter an environment in that space, because even if you refuse to take their money, they're still using the language that you use in your work in order to articulate their ends. And so it's quite insidious, actually, because it's not easy to defend against the incursion of tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of dollars into what is necessarily a small, very often small and grassroots sectors. And sometimes it's a political thing, and sometimes it's a technical thing. I think a second point, and I think, Dowdy, I'd be really interested to hear what you think about this, is that, and I think you touched on it a little bit already, is that when donors see technical ideas that work in one place and then try to expand them to other places, they inadvertently mistake the technical for the political, and they seek to make those ideas social, and they wind up creating entire sectors of business or of operations that only exist because that money is there. I mean, I can think about as a simple example, the British development agency DFID has been working in Bangladesh for 35 years. And in Bangladesh, there's a whole sector of journalism that's called development journalism that pretty much only exists in Bangladesh. And it's there to report, well, increasingly it's elsewhere, but its goal is to report on the successes of development agencies. And people have spent their entire professional careers working just in development journalism, and all of it's funded by DFID. And people think it's a real career. And it kind of is, but it's a bubble. It's an economic bubble. And the challenge for us is that so much of what we do when we're successful looks attractive to others. And we need to navigate very carefully to ensure that the spaces that we stay in, that we're in, remain authentic as voices, remain authentic and transparent in terms of the sources of funding. And sometimes you can tell, because so many of these projects are sort of supply side. I think I like to describe them as they're driven by the agendas of the donors, and rather than by the needs of the people who are working on the projects, or the needs of the communities in which they're being implemented. And that tension is a really kind of a threshold, always something to look at when you're thinking about a project you're working on or something that you're thinking about getting involved in.
Yeah, as Dowdy was saying, organic, was sort of a key word that Ellery was mentioning as well. And yeah, is an idea going to be organically situated and then get funded because the community wanted it, or is it going to just be imposed? So, questions, comments, thoughts, reactions. Does anybody on the panel want to react to anything that got said?
Yeah, perhaps we can even make some of these things into guides that people could follow, because we talked a lot about transparency, and I think we agree that where possible you should be transparent about the funding that you get, because people will notice that you have money because you can pay people. And even if you need to weigh what you want to do with the credibility, a very well-known project that you probably all know has suffered from this a lot. You probably all know the Tor project. Who knows the Tor? Who knows the Tor project?
Everybody.
Okay, good. It's a project to provide anonymity online, which is crucial in this day and age. But the only way it's possible to do that is with US government funding, which is ironic, because it's also at the same time the US government trying to break this software. And they also, a lot of people say, we don't trust the software, even though it's open source, because it's funded by the US government. So they have to spend a lot of time defending themselves against it. And they do, and I think successfully so, and I think you can trust Tor, but you need to put a lot of time in this. And do you want that? That's a thing you need to think about. Then the organic growth thing. So it's much easier to fundraise if you already have something that works. So if you first build something that shows that works, then it's much easier to attract funders. But if you have something that works, then many funders will come to you. And that's a good moment to start diversifying your income. Because if you're dependent on one donor, you're becoming more dependent. And in the beginning, it might seem all okay, but when the funding runs out, you want to continue. And then there might be other conditions. So depending on several donors always really helps. And then finally, separation of areas. And this is especially with corporate funding. So if Google asks you to work on internet governance, you might need to think twice, because that will really influence you, or it will at least be perceived that you influence defending Google's agenda, and they will not fund you for nothing. So it's a good thing to think about, to weigh that even if you do the work, if you want to have the impact, people will also need to see you as credible.
Yeah. Ellery, you.
Well, yeah, I guess so, Niels, the first point that you made, you said that it wouldn't have been possible to make Tor, that the only way to do this was with US government money. And I really hope that's not true. I mean, I think it's probably sort of idealistic of me, but I sometimes wish that the US government would just stop trying to fund things.
Stop funding things.
Yeah, just stop. Like, you need to spend money on other stuff, you know? I don't know. It's because of how poisonous it is in some places. That's what has led me there. But I think, especially being part of Global Voices, which, yes, we have a lot of challenges and kind of difficult decisions to have to make around funding, we're also incredibly lightweight, and working with volunteers makes you realize, like, this whole other sort of alternative economy of value, and, you know, it's like, could we not do more of that and less of sort of assuming that the only option we have is to take money from governments that we really...
take no U.S. government funding, just
I know.
for the record.
Oh, yeah.
In case there was any misperception. No, we don't even take indirect U.S. government money. Ivan can explain, there are some governments that indirectly, you know, it filters to GV, but there was basically the decisions very early on. When Global Voices started, we came out of the Berkman Center at Harvard, and which does take government money, but we were not taking that money. But initially we were getting money from MacArthur and Reuters. That was our startup money, and OSF a little bit. But when we were forming an independent NGO, there was quite a bit of discussion. There were two discussions. One was, what country should this NGO be based in? And there were some members of our community who said, you shouldn't be registered in the United States. This was during the Bush administration still, and there were some people in certain regions who were like, you know, we will be much happier working with Global Voices if it's registered outside the United States. And so we ended up in the Netherlands. So we're a Stichting, or how do you pronounce it? Stichting. And yeah, and we don't have an office there. We can't speak Dutch. But the other thing that people made very clear was no U.S. government funding, you know, no UK government funding, and sort of obviously the Snowden revelations have kind of confirmed that. We don't take any direct government funding. There are, you know, Hivos is here, you know, we have our funders on our website. Hivos receives Dutch government money, which it then regrants to us. So there are some cases, and it's really a kind of discussion with the community. You know, we kind of, whenever we make a new decision about a new type of funding, we check in with our core team, we check in with people with kind of, you know, who are, you know, well connected within the parts of our community that are at risk in sensitive places, and we really do a temperature check on, you know, what is this going to mean, and we think through it, and we have to do that because that's our responsibility. But it certainly means we say no to. I mean, I was there was one instance where somebody from the State Department came up to me and said, "Can we fund you?" I was like, "Sorry, no." And but we wouldn't be what we are if we were taking that money. So.
But just to make a slightly different point, every form of revenue income stream has its own set of dependencies. So, and even not taking money has a set of dependencies, because if we're a, purely volunteer organizations mean that volunteers have to have the time and the resources to participate, which means people without time and without resources can't. So constituency-based organizations mean that you have to serve your constituency, which means that you spend a lot of time on constituency management and on publicity of your work in a certain way, and that takes a set of resources and that has a set of constraints as well. So I think if I were to put one principle forward for those of you thinking about money, it's the follow the money principle. What are the constraints or potentially negative incentives that come from being affiliated with one source or another? But there's no such thing as independence. It's just the nature of our dependencies. And those interdependencies, and I think that's the way I tend to think of it, actually matter a lot, because we have the potential, if you know what you stand for, and I think we've heard this several times, if you have a strategy, you have the ability to influence the people who are giving money in the first place, influence how they give and why they give, and that's kind of the funding strategy that we put forward, that we're trying to help people to think about the influence of their money more broadly.
I'm learning so much from these guys. I hope you guys are too. Yeah, just to add on to what Ivan is saying, follow the money, and ironically, it's even more important to follow the money when you're saying no to the money. To give you an example from Kenya, or from many of our countries, one of the most expensive things for a government to run is elections. It's also one of the areas that's most sensitive in areas of foreign influence. So when we were doing our Kenya election deployment, we refused any form of the foreign government funding in our work, because this is a Kenyan election. We don't want any questions about conflict of interest, so we said no to everything. Maybe a bit naive, because we found out that the electoral commission in our country and the electoral commissions in several of our countries are funded by foreign governments. So refusing that government funding meant that they closed the door to our own electoral commission in our face. And there are a lot of relationships, there are a lot of things that may have been easier that could have been done if we had accepted to work with one of these foreign governments. We don't know. But yeah, a lot of things were closed in our face because we said no. So when you're saying no, it's very important that Ivan says, follow the money and find out what exactly it is you're rejecting and which of your partners is working with that fund and how that may affect you.
Yeah, and I think what's coming out here too is this is all very contextual, and the context of your decision matters. Now, we had a hand there and we have a hand here. I don't know if that mic works. Does it work?
Hello, okay, it's working. Yeah, I have a question. I mean, we're talking about generalities here, but maybe you can tell us a very, very specific story. Like, for instance, so could you tell us about a certain story that you work on, and then how were you able to get funding for it? And when you got all those stories out there, how do you think those stories, were you able to get your objectives by having those stories released into the general public? And how do you measure that you were actually successful? And how did your funder react to those success or failure? Thank you.
I can tell a brief story. This is probably about 10 years old now. Starting in 2002, I worked with an organization that helped to set up the independent non-state radio sector in Afghanistan. And we built an initial project that was based on the idea that we were going to build stations that ran at the basis of local economies. So they were very small. It spent less than $15,000, $20,000 to build each station. And we built the first 20 stations for $1.5 million, which is a tiny amount of money. This was in 2003, 2004. 3 years later, the Taliban, the resurgence of the conflict in Afghanistan occurred, and it got increasingly more dangerous, and the project was very successful. We managed to build 35 stations, and they had real audiences, and a huge amount of strategic communications money from the UN and from the USAID and other international donors came into the system to support the war effort against the Taliban. And the same donors that had previously been supporting us for community development projects now wanted us to work on strategic communications projects. And suddenly we're offering upwards of $10 million a year to do the same thing, to put stations in dangerous places. That would primarily, and they were also putting stations on, on military bases and broadcasting content that looked a lot like local contexts. And lastly, they were buying advertising on the stations that we built that blew the market out of the water. I mean, spending thousands of dollars a month on advertising for a station where their average salary was $20, completely destroying the local economy. So that's, to me, a really clear example of how a development agenda has a donor agenda completely changes the nature of a development project and a local agendas.
Let's go more to some folks sitting. We've got you, and then we've got the lady there.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting discussion, thank you. I just wanted to... Sorry, my name is Richard King. I'm from the Open Rights Group in the UK. We're a digital rights organisation, and we also seek funding for things. I just wanted to comment on what Ivan was saying, and a little bit of what you were saying as well about the effect of huge amounts of funding being pumped into the area in which your NGO is operating, and the perception that your supporters might have of your funding, even if you don't take that funding money. We've had instances where some of our supporters have said, well, of course, all you NGOs in this sector take money from X because they have a huge amount of money to give, so you must be in the pocket of these people, so why should we trust you? And you're almost starting from a negative point of view, you're starting behind on your ambition to show your transparency or show how you are funded and make people understand your agendas and things. So I don't know if the panel has any comments on that or any advice to give NGOs on how to counter that almost propaganda effect of huge amounts of funding coming in from big funders.
Yeah, that kind of reinforces what Ivan was saying about, even if you don't take funding, the funding's still effective.
Yeah, that negative perception. I mean, I forgot to add at the end of my election story that the donor the government agency that we refused funding from, then released the official election report that completely slaughtered us. And we were like, I mean, what? So it was a double whammy. So, yeah, dealing with local perceptions, I think it always comes down to partnerships and who you know. And, I work for a technology company, but we always say technology is at best 10% of any story. The relationships is what is crucial. And just may quickly jumping to the gentleman who wanted specific examples of how to get funding or success stories around funding. The first funding Ushahidi ever got, $25,000, came from a 2-minute pitch where two of the co-founders, Eric Hirschman and David Kobia, stood in front of a judge, a panel. They had 2 minutes to make their pitch, and they got $25,000, and that's the very first funding Ushahidi got. So it doesn't always have to be a long report. The second story I can tell you is about this, which is our first hardware product called the Brick. It's an internet connectivity device. You can put in a SIM card, you can put in an Ethernet port, it has Wi-Fi, but we knew that although a lot of donors would be willing to fund this, it's a commercial product, it has to be tested by the market. So to raise the initial $125,000 to build the first prototype, instead of going to donor funding, we did a Kickstarter campaign, crowdfunding, and basically asked the market, do you think there's value in this? And when that Kickstarter was successful, then we knew, hey, we're onto something here. So again, another untraditional way of raising funds that can then get access to more funds.
That's great. We have a woman here. It seems that mic works.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Vishaka. I work with a non-profit organization in Mumbai, India. I wanted to make a couple of comments and ask a question. So my comment is, you know, sometimes in movements which have large volunteer communities, the funding thing becomes really complex. We see that offline in India, for instance, in the LGBT movement, which got funded relatively recently, and people who had been working as volunteers in the LGBT movement, sort of, there was a little bit of a distancing from the funded part of the movement, right? And online we actually see that in Wikipedia, where we have 75,000 volunteers who, you know, edit or write Wikipedia as we call it, and we have the Wikimedia Foundation in San Francisco, which raises about $50 million a year, mostly crowd-funded. And there's been an extremely complicated relationship between the staff at the foundation and the volunteers, because even though we all agree that funding is good, what tends to happen is that volunteers start questioning why staff is needed to do something that volunteers previously did. So I don't have sort of an answer or anything. I just thought it'd be a, you know, something I wanted to share. The question I wanted to ask you all is actually, you know, how do we think of sort of accountability beyond donors? Meaning, of course, technically we are accountable to donors for the money that we raise, but we've raised it for something, right? For another group of people. So if anybody has any thoughts.
Yeah, how to be accountable to our stakeholders. Yeah. Who wants to? Gohary?
I just wanted to say I couldn't agree with you more. That this is the fundamental reason why the donor model is broken, because we are not reporting to the beneficiaries. It's not the beneficiaries, the people who receive training or who are on the receiving end of the work, who are judging us. And that's why it takes donor education. And I think increasingly working on this with good monitoring and evaluation. And we should also make this a standard for ourselves. We should only be satisfied when the people that we are delivering our services to are satisfied with it as well. And that also brings up another thing that I've encountered. Donors do not always dislike failures. We are self-correcting often that we think we always need to have success stories. But if we come to an insight halfway the project, like, we really need to change this. This is not working. Don't continue something that's not working just because you need to report on it. Have a discussion on it and have an open discussion about it with the donor. And then, again, donors are also people. And then we'll see, can it be fixed? Do we need someone else to have a look at it and then go forward on it? And this also has to do with this level of transparency and being able to work openly towards the common goals that we have.
I think there's also the issue of journalism here, is how independent journalism can cover NGOs that really do real things on the ground versus other NGOs that just do it for the money. They don't do it for the cause. So, but it also depends on the country you're working in. So, like for Egypt, journalism is mostly business journalism. Then they're not really concerned with this kind of covering. And non-for-profit journalism is really emerging just very recently, and even for the rest of the world, I think it's probably we shouldn't be shy about promoting ourselves when we're doing real stuff on the ground, because the rest of NGOs are shameless, even when they're not doing something on the ground. So we should be less shy and also form concrete relationships with journalists who are true to journalism, who think journalism is delivering the truth. So, and when that happens, I think real development or working or NGOs will have more influence on the ground.
Just 2 seconds on Wikipedia. It's really interesting that you bring them up, because their funding model is actually really unusual in that they're able to fund themselves entirely from their constituency. So they have an unusual congruence, and yet they still have conflict. So, you know, congruence is no guarantee of absence of conflict.
So we have like 3 minutes, so I can either get your comment or get the question from John. John, you want to go to the mic there? and then we'll respond, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
I was just thinking whether or not to ask this question, but since you, I was
Who
just
are you,
thinking.
John?
Can you hear me now?
Tell us who you are.
I used to be the Chinese language editor for Global Voices Online until early 2012. No, I was just thinking, would Global Voices Online, and I currently work for Amnesty International, would Global Voices Online ever consider adopting to a membership funding model like Wikipedia or Amnesty in the future?
We would, if we could find a successful model for making it happen. Because one of the things that's amazing about Wikimedia's funding strategy is that it's the 5th largest website in the world. And the people who fund it, it's actually a tiny percentage of the people who use it. And Sue Gardner, who's the former executive director of the Wikimedia Foundation, is on our board. And that's actually really helpful because she's been great about educating us about what does or doesn't work. Given our current traffic for Global Voices and our current size in comparison, we would, if we were as efficient as they are in raising money, we would make about $70,000 a year using the membership or online donor model. So it's a scale issue. And it's actually, when you think about the Wikipedia scenario, 5th largest website in the world, they only make $60 million a year. I mean, really? Google makes how many billions? So it's a tiny amount of money considering their scale. That said, it is definitely something we're really interested in if we can come up with a valid model. The big challenge with it, though, is that a constituency to have that kind of model requires that your constituency has resources. And so we have to think about the implications of building a system like that in terms of who can participate, or if we're trying to raise money from different communities, who they are and what that might do to our content.
I'm getting the signal, but I do want to give Ellery a chance to say something because you were sort of raising your hand, and it's positive, she says. So we will end on that note.
So Niels talked about accountability to your constituency and how being accountable to a funder is really different than being accountable to whomever you're trying to work with or serve. And I actually think that this is one of the things I find most satisfying about my job is that, yes, I do have to write a grant narrative from time to time and, do that stuff. But most of the time, the value that I think our community derives from the work that we do comes out of our connections with each other, traffic, attention that our work gets, and maybe changes that it helps to bring about. So it's not all bad. Well, and you don't want to lose sight of the actual work. Like if you start to just become your funder, whoever your funder is, then I think that's sort of bleak.
Be true to yourself, right? Be true to yourself, be true to your community, be true to your constituency. Know who you are. Know who you are and why you exist and what your real purpose is, right? And now we're going to meditate. No, thank you very much. This was great. Thank you.